You're watching Noir Street. I'm your host, Nero Wolfe. Every story hides a secret, and every shadow hides a clue. Tell us where in the world you're watching from. Subscribe, tap the like button, and join us as we drift into mystery. Chapter 1. The Smile That Stayed Behind. If you have never attended an engagement party among people with enough money to mistake upholstery for ancestry, I can recommend the omission. The champagne is reliable, the conversation is not, and everyone behaves as if happiness was something that could be arranged correctly by florists, silver, and the seating chart. It cannot. Happiness is a vulgar, independent thing. It enters without being announced and leaves before the valet can find its coat. That evening on East 64th Street, at the Harrow Town House, they had done everything humanly possible to hold it still. The drawing rooms were full of candlelight, polished brass, lilies that smelled expensive enough to require references, and the sort of string quartet that knows how to play love as if it were a private school subject. Men wore white tie or money, and in that house the distinction was minor. Women wore satin, diamonds, old grievance, fresh hope, and perfumes that ought to have been registered with the fire department. There was a butler at the door, who looked as if the decline of civilization had arrived twice already, and he had admitted it both times against his will. At the center of it all stood Lila Harrow. She was not the richest woman in the room, not the most jeweled, and certainly not the least watched. She was 26, tall, pale in the clear, deliberate way that suits dark hair, and wearing an ivory gown, so simple it probably cost 3 times as much as a vulgar one. She had the kind of face that made strangers assume softness and acquaintances correct them. Her smile was steady, gracious, and faintly overqualified, like a diplomat assigned to peace among idiots. The man she was to marry was named Edwin Vale, though in fairness to him he was only intermittently a fool. He was 34, handsome in the dark, neat style of a man who had always known which barber to trust, and composed in the newer way: finance, trusts, advisory work, percentages, committees, and the sort of confidence that comes from having survived no hardship he did not convert into policy. He looked proud, nervous, triumphant, and faintly surprised, as if he had acquired a masterpiece, and worried that someone from the museum might arrive with paperwork. At 9:32, because I checked later, a photographer with a bald head and the self-importance of his profession asked Miss Harrow and Mr. Vale to stand by the mantel in the blue drawing room. They did. Behind them on the mantel stood a silver picture frame the size of a small proclamation. It held a sepia portrait of Lila's dead mother, which was exactly the sort of thing old families like to arrange into new happiness, partly from sentiment and partly from surveillance. The photographer posed them, moved a candelabrum 3 inches, objected to a flower bowl, shifted it himself, and took the picture. Within 6 minutes, Lila Harrow had vanished. No cry, no broken glass, no torn hem, no note left on satin, no theatrical evidence of abduction or despair, just absence, which is harder on the nerves than blood if the right people are present to appreciate it. And one photograph, still damp, holding something no one noticed at first glance. But I am running ahead, which is always tempting in murder, and nearly always a mistake. Wolfe says sequence is the backbone of truth. I say it is also the enemy of a good opening, but he outranks me in philosophy and chair ownership. So you may have the backbone. The matter reached us at 10:20 that same evening. Wolfe had had a satisfactory dinner, which improved the world by a measurable amount, and was in the office with his second bottle of beer and a monograph on orchids that would have interested precisely 4 men in New York, all of them safely impossible as house guests. Fritz was in the kitchen putting civilization back together after supper. I was at my desk adding columns of figures for a client who lied as if arithmetic were optional, and wondering whether I could delay proving him wrong until tomorrow without injuring my professional self-respect beyond repair. The telephone rang. I picked it up because I was nearest, and because in our house telephones are considered my department, in the same way trench warfare is considered the infantry's Nero Wolfe's office. Archie Goodwin speaking. A man's voice said, "Mr. Goodwin, this is Adrian Harrow. I must speak with Mr. Wolfe at once." That usually means one of 3 things: panic, vanity, or an invoice overdue enough to produce either. I asked. Have you been murdered, arrested, or disappointed by lawyers? There was a pause shaped like distaste then. My niece is missing. That got my attention enough to sit straighter. How missing? She was here. Now she is not. That's the beginner's model. Give me the improved version. My niece Lila Harrow became engaged this evening to Julian Fisk. There was a gathering, guests, music, supper, a photographer. She was photographed in the blue drawing room at approximately 9:30. A few minutes later she was gone. We have searched the house. She is not here. I looked toward Wolf. He had raised his eyes from the orchid journal and was watching me over the rim of the beer glass with the expression he reserves for interruptions that might earn continued existence. I covered the mouthpiece. A man named Adrian Harrow. Niece vanished at engagement party. Searched house. Not found. Wolf set the glass down. Ask whether the police have been called, I asked. No, Adrian Harrow said. Not yet. Inspector Kramer is a family acquaintance. But once this enters the police files, the newspapers will have it by dawn. Lila may have left of her own will, or she may not. I want Mr. Wolf's judgment before I expose her to scandal. That had shape and smell both. Wealth always wants judgment privately and scandal publicly blamed on fate. Wolf said. Ask if there has been a quarrel, I asked. Adrian Harrow answered too quickly. Number that made Wolf close one eye, which in his language means the opposite of belief. Ask if there is any evidence, he said. I asked. Another pause, this one less elegant, only the photograph. I relayed that. Wolf held out his hand for the telephone, and I gave it to him because when he chooses to take a call himself, there is always a reason and often a result. This is Nero Wolf, he said. You will answer precisely. What about the photograph? He listened for nearly a minute, saying nothing, which is one of his more expensive talents. Then he said, Photograhy, softly, and after another interval, Number Mr. Goodwin come. Touch nothing further. Do not summon the police until he has seen the room, unless you discover a corpse. If you discover one, you may telephone Inspector Kramer, and then collapse if you wish. He hung up. Well, I asked. Archie, go at once, East 64th Street, Adrian Harrow's house. The woman Lila Harrow disappeared after the photograph was taken. He says, the print shows, in the reflection of a silver frame on the mantel, the partial image of a woman none of the family recognizes, and none of the invited guests admit to having seen. That's pretty. It is absurd. Yes, those are often neighbors. Wolf ignored that. Learn who was present, who took the photograph, who saw Miss Harrow last, whether she had reason to flee, and whether the reflected woman is actually unknown or merely unwanted. Also determine what was in the silver frame before sentiment became evidence. I got my hat and coat. Fritz appeared from nowhere carrying a dish towel and his full opinion of the century. You go out again? Yes, at night. That's when crimes notice me. He looked at Wolf. He will be late. Yes, Wolf said. Fritz's mouth compressed. Then I shall keep coffee. That is love in our house. No violins, just coffee under protest. The Harrow townhouse stood where many rich houses stand in New York, on a block that had once meant family, and now meant survival by renovations discreet enough to keep the dead from complaining. The stone front was severe and expensive. 2 automobiles waited outside, one chauffeur asleep upright in the front seat, and another pretending not to listen to the sidewalk voices. There were sidewalk voices already because there are always sidewalk voices if enough light is on in enough windows at the wrong hour. Inside, the air held beeswax, flowers, expensive tobacco, and alarm carefully folded into manners. A footman admitted me with a face that suggested my existence had damaged his evening irreparably. Before he could complete the injury by announcing me in the wrong tone, a man crossed the hall from the drawing room. Adrian Harrow was in his early 50s, tall, lean, and cut from the sort of old money reserve that does not so much dislike emotion as invoice it later. He had grey at the temples, a black evening coat, and eyes that had once probably been handsome and were now merely practiced. "Mr. Goodwin." "Yes, thank you for coming." "You haven't thanked me yet. Show me the trouble." He took me first not to the blue drawing room, but to a small library off the front hall where half a dozen people had been gathered and trying to look occupied. That is one thing panic does in a rich house. It gives everybody an urgent interest in standing still. Edwin Vale was there, white-faced and overcomposed. Beside him, on a sofa, sat a woman in black satin, and emeralds, I later learned, was Celia Harrow Brent, Lila's aunt and Adrian's sister, carrying enough family criticism in her jaw to light a boulevard. There was also a narrow man with gold spectacles named Martin Vale, the family solicitor, a plump woman in mauve silk who had been some kind of honorary hostess, and the photographer, a miserable, bald individual clutching his camera case as if it had begun all this on purpose. "No, Lila," I said. "Start with the photograph." Julian Fisk made a movement toward the desk and checked it halfway, which told me that whatever his virtues, spontaneity was not among them. Adrian Harrow opened a leather folder and handed me an 8x10 print. It showed Lila Harrow and Edwin Vale standing beneath the portrait on the mantel. She was smiling. He was trying to. The candelabra had done their duty, the flowers were tasteful, the silver frame at the right edge, polished enough to catch half the room, reflected more than candlelight. It reflected the side doorway, and standing in it, the dark, slim figure of a woman in a hat with a veil, turned partly away, as if watching and not belonging. It was not Lila. It was not Celia Brent. It was not the mauve hostess. It was not anyone a careful look could match to the roomful of present distress. That was good. Cases improve when the evidence has the decency to arrive dressed. I said, "Who noticed this first?" The photographer raised a hand faintly, like a schoolboy confessing to algebra. "I developed a rapid proof in the pantry washroom. Just a contact test, you understand. Because Mr. Fisk wanted to see whether another exposure was needed. I brought it out, and Miss Brent saw the reflection." Celia Brent said, "Do not call me Miss Anything. I have suffered matrimony and survived it." That established her neatly enough. I looked again at the print. The reflected woman stood where the side passage met the drawing room threshold. If the timing was true, she had been there when the shutter clicked and gone, or hidden, soon after. That made her either a guest, a servant with dangerous taste in hats, or the kind of person who enters a rich house without introductions and leaves it with the best part. "Now, Lila," I said, "who saw her last?" Edwin Vale answered. His voice was well-bred, educated, and trying not to tremble at the edges. After the photograph, she laughed at something the photographer said, something about holding happiness still for 2 seconds. Then someone called to me from the far side of the room, and Lila said she would return in a moment. She crossed toward the side passage. I was detained by guests and congratulations. When I looked again, she was not in the room. How long? 5 minutes, perhaps 6. That's plenty, if you know what you're doing. Adrian Harrow said. We searched the house immediately. Every room, every floor, the terrace, the service yard. Her cloak remains upstairs. Her handbag is in her bedroom. There is no note, no sound. I asked. No, he said. No cry, no quarrel, no broken glass, no hysterics, except what I see here. That did not improve any of them. I turned to Celia Brent. Your niece would not leave her own engagement party for amusement. Number. For nerves. Possibly for fear. At that. She looked at Adrian Harrow first and then at me. That was the first honest movement in the room, I said. Good. We've found family. Adrian's face hardened. Mr. Goodwin. Yes. You told Wolf there had been no quarrel. That was too quick. Start again. He drew breath through his nose and released it as if the air had disappointed him personally. Lila was not eager for this engagement. Julian Fisk turned. That is not true. Celia Brent said, It is nearly true, which is how families tell lies when they are tired. This was improving. I put the photograph on the desk blotter and took out my notebook. Now we may begin. Chapter 2. The reflection no one claimed when a photograph produces a roomful of rich people, and no two of them agree on what they are seeing. The temperature drops faster than manners. I have observed this often enough to recommend against cameras at weddings, funerals, and meetings of corporate boards. They catch too much, and what they miss gets invented at once. At the Harrow House on East 64th Street, the invention had already begun. I left the library with the print in my hand, and Adrian Harrow's people behind me in stages of dismay, denial, and moral upholstery. The blue drawing room was empty now, except for a footman who was trying to restore order to a tray of abandoned glasses, as if Crystal had committed the offense and not the bloodline. The room was handsome in the cold, deliberate way such rooms are: pale blue walls, cream molding, tall mirrors, a black marble mantel with silver on it, and flowers too correct to smell human. It had already been the scene of an engagement and a disappearance in the same hour, and it was taking both badly. I stood where the photographer had stood and held the print up beside the mantel to compare angle and reflection. That is the advantage of dealing with facts before the family has time to revise them into something suitable for grandchildren. The silver frame on the mantel was large, oval, topped, and polished to a brightness that would have annoyed Wolfe on principle. It held a sepia portrait of Lila's mother, dead these 10 years, and still supervising the room by inches of reflected silver. In the photograph the frame had caught, besides candlelight and the edge of the candelabra, the side doorway leading toward the smaller hall. And there, just within that reflected opening, stood the stranger. She was no ghost. Ghosts never dress so sensibly. The figure was that of a woman in a dark coat and hat with a small veil or netting at the brim, not enough face to identify, but enough posture to annoy me. She was standing still, slightly angled, watching the scene at the mantel the way a person watches something to which she believes herself connected, but not invited. Her shoulders were narrow. Her head was lifted. There was nothing blurred or accidental about her. She had stood there long enough to be taken by the lens and short enough, or cleverly enough, not to fix herself in anybody's memory. That is not haunting. That is placement. I heard steps and turned. The photographer had drifted in behind me because men who create trouble by chemistry always hope to improve it by hovering. "You see," he said. "Yes. I tell you that woman was not in the room before." "You mean before you noticed the evidence of her?" He swallowed, which slightly improved him. "I should have seen her. Number, you should have seen your exposure time. People are optional." He did not enjoy that, which meant I was recovering nicely. I had him show me precisely where Lila and Julian had been standing, where Edwin had stood, how long he had focused, who had moved the candelabrum, who had crossed behind him. He had no answer to the last, which did not surprise me. Men like that see faces only when the faces object to them. Still, one useful thing came out of him. The shutter had not clicked at once. He had counted, adjusted, and then taken the plate after a delay of perhaps 10 seconds. 10 seconds is long enough to enter a reflected doorway, long enough to stop deliberately, and long enough to go unremembered if the room's attention is fixed on the happy couple. I took the print into the side passage. It was a short corridor, paneled halfway up, with one door to the music room, another to a little card salon, and beyond that, a turn toward the back stair and private hall. At the reflected angle shown in the silver frame, a woman standing in the opening would not have been visible to anyone facing Lila and Julian directly, unless they had a habit of watching polished metal instead of people. The passage was shaded, the drawing room bright. That helped the stranger. It also meant she had known enough to stand where she would be seen by silver and ignored by flesh. That is not intrusion either. It is familiarity. I found the servants next because servants always know more than guests and admit less, which makes them ideal for my line of work. The butler gave me the social list with the expression of a man handing over hostages. A parlour maid said she had seen no unknown woman. A footman said the side hall had been clear. The housemaid in charge of wraps said no lady had departed without cloak, hat, or complaint. The cook knew nothing, which I believed because cooks in houses like that know everything edible and very little else. The upstairs maid confirmed that Lila's evening cloak remained in her dressing room and that her handbag lay open on the toilet table with powder, keys, a handkerchief, and nothing dramatic in it. "Did Miss Harrow seem upset dressing?" I asked. "No, sir," the maid said. "Only quiet. Quiet from joy." She thought about it and decided not to lie merely for wages. "Quiet from being looked at, sir." That was worth keeping. Back downstairs I had Adrian Harrow, Edwin Vale, and Celia Brent in the blue drawing room with the print on the mantel, and the silver frame beside it. I always prefer putting the evidence in the room that created it. "It unsettles people into honesty," I said. "Now we try memory, which is unreliable but cheaper than psychoanalysis." This woman in the reflection, not a guest, you say, not a servant, they say. Therefore she was either invisible, which I reject, or she belongs somewhere near enough to be ignored. Widwin Vale said sharply, "If you mean one of the family, I mean only what I say. That is why I'm paid better than a lawyer." Celia Brent leaned toward the print with the interest of a woman who would rather confront danger than be left alone with relatives. "She has a hat," she said. "No woman invited here tonight wore a hat indoors." "That helps," Adrian Harrow said. "A late arrival, perhaps?" "No," I said. "Because your hall man says none came through that way at the time, and because a late arrival with enough breeding for that coat would have announced herself to the room before standing in a passage like a governess with blackmail." That hit harder than I intended, which meant I was near something. Julian said, "What are you suggesting?" "That the woman was no stranger to the house. A stranger slips, hesitates, asks, or wrong. Foot's a servant. This one stood exactly where reflection would catch her and people would not. She knew the passage, she knew the room, and she knew the household well enough to trust that standing still for 10 seconds would make her invisible." "Nobody liked that," Celia Brent said. "Invisible women are often the ones families support quietly." There it was, dropped among the silver like a lit match. Adrian Harrow turned his head slowly toward her. "Celia," she met him. "What? We are pretending less now, aren't we?" Widwin said. "I don't understand." "No," said Celia Brent. "That has always been your contribution." I stepped in before they could improve family history by making it audible to the servants. "Good, we have at least one useful sentence. Mr. Harrow, I want a full list of everyone in this house tonight, including family members, dependents, companions, secretaries, old retainers, and any person whose presence is usually omitted in conversation, because omission is cheaper than acknowledgement." His face changed. Not much, but enough to prove I had stopped amusing him. "That is an offensive way to speak in my sister's house." "Yes, that is because your sister is missing." He gave me the list, though not gracefully. It included the expected names, the expected guests, one elderly aunt too deaf to be useful, 2 cousins too decorative to be sane, a secretary named Martin Dace, and a paid companion for the aunt. No unknown woman, no hat, no explanation. I asked for Lila's room. Julian objected and Adrian overruled him, which told me a little about the engagement already. Upstairs, Lila's room was cool, exact, and pretty in the way women's rooms in rich houses are pretty when the woman herself has paid for some of the choices with intelligence. Books actually read. Flowers not overdone, a writing desk shut. On the dressing table, no note. In the wardrobe, her cloak, in the drawer, gloves. On the bed, one narrow silver comb set aside as if in haste or habit. Nothing looked ransacked, abandoned, or dramatic. That bothered me more than if I had found a window open. At the dressing table mirror, I saw what she would have seen leaving the room, the hall, the stairhead, and below, through the rail opening part of the lower passage, leading toward the blue drawing room. If Lila had come upstairs after the photograph, she might have been observed by anyone below, without seeing them clearly herself. I went back down with that, and the print still in my pocket. By then the house had grown colder than the night outside. Not in actual temperature, in that internal way, Houses do when a disappearance has lasted long enough to become fact. The quartet had long since been dismissed. The flowers were now decorative witnesses. Every smile taken earlier in the evening had started looking counterfeit in memory. At the front hall, Adrian Harrow asked. "Well?" I said. The woman in the reflection was not forgotten because she was a ghost. She was forgotten because she belonged to the house in some way the room had trained itself not to notice. She stood close enough to be seen and distant enough to be ignored. That takes practice from both sides. Edwin stared. Celia Brent did not, Adrian said. "Who is she?" "That," I told him, "is what Mr. Wolfe will decide after I make him unhappy with your family." I took the print back to West 35th a little before midnight. Wolfe was in the office with beer, lamp, and patience in correct proportion. I gave him the photograph, the house, the passage angle, the 10-second delay, the servant's denials, Celia Brent's loose remark about quietly supported women, and my conclusion. When I finished, he opened one eye and said, "Yes," that word again. The reflected woman did not intrude. She belonged. Therefore, Miss Harrow's disappearance is connected, not merely with the engagement, but with whatever the household has trained itself to overlook. Good. Tomorrow we begin with the family's omissions. That was enough for the night. Upstairs later, standing by my window with the city giving back light in wet scraps from the street below, I thought about the silver frame. It had done what polished things often do in rich houses, revealed the person no one wished to mention. Not by kindness, by geometry. Lila Harrow had vanished. The room had yielded one image, and in that image stood a woman who had not slipped into the house at all. She had already belonged somewhere inside it. Chapter 3. The bride who hesitated. By the next morning, the Harrow engagement had improved into scandal without the help of newspapers, which is the way such families prefer it if they can manage the privilege. The guests had gone home with their diamonds, opinions, and selective memories. The flowers were still standing about the drawing rooms, pretending nothing serious had happened among them. The silver frame had been wrapped and put aside under my direction, which caused distress because rich people always think evidence ought to be polished before use. Lila Harrow remained missing. That was the only fact in the house with any manners. Wolfe had heard my midnight report from the red leather chair in the office and taken it in with his usual economy. 1 beer, 2 grunts, and a sentence sharp enough to keep. "Archie, the disappearance is not the opening movement. It is the cadence. Find what came before." Meaning. Miss Harrow did not vanish into a vacuum. She reacted to something. The reflected woman, the passage, the glance toward the silver frame. Those are not decorations. They are sequence. So at 10 the next morning I was back on East 64th Street, where the Harrow house had taken on the exhausted respectability of a place trying to survive its own furniture. Adrian Harrow met me in the front hall with that careful reserve families use when they believe composure is hereditary. "You have spoken with Mr. Wolfe?" "Yes. And he is not impressed by silver." That failed to amuse him, which was no surprise. The rich are rarely at their best before noon when a daughter has vanished, and the social columns are not yet safely in print. I began with Lila's closest friend, because it is one of the advantages of my profession that I know where to look first. Mothers lie for blood, fiancés for pride, uncles for property, and servants for wages. Nora Elwell was in the morning room by the window, wearing yesterday's blue silk, with the defeated look of a woman who had slept in fragments and hated all of them. She was about Lila's age, fair, lively in the ordinary way, when not under pressure, and carrying the remains of good breeding over a nervous disposition. Her gloves were in her lap, twisted into a confession. I introduced myself and said, "Miss Elwell, if you tell me your friend had never been happier, I'll have to take it as an opening lie and work from there." That startled her into honesty, which is one of my better tricks. "She wasn't unhappy," Nora said. "That's not the same thing." Number. She looked at the gloves and then at me. Lila had been unsettled. Since when? A week, perhaps longer. About the engagement. Not exactly. That word is cheap. Spend more. She gave a short breath, half laugh and half defeat. "Mr. Goodwin." Lila did not love being arranged. She liked Julian well enough, perhaps more than well enough at times. He is handsome, solvent, and approved by everybody likely to send silver, which in this house counts heavily. But she had not looked happy yesterday. She looked— Nora searched for it, interrupted. That was the right word, and because it matched my own impression, I trusted it enough to continue. Interrupted by what? Nora hesitated. When a girl vanishes at her own engagement party, I said, hesitation becomes a luxury item. She nodded and lowered her voice, though the room held nobody within earshot, except flowers. Lila told me on Tuesday that she thought someone had come back. Who? She didn't say, or rather she said, if she has come back, then they have lied to me longer than I knew. That widened the room by a yard. She? Yes. You asked who? Of course I did. Lila laughed and said she was being melodramatic, and that too much family history was bad for the skin. But she was frightened, Mr. Goodwin. Not theatrical frightened, angry frightened. I liked Nora better by the minute, which is always dangerous when women are giving you what you need. Did she say where she had seen this returned person? Number only that she had received a note. From whom? She wouldn't tell me. She tore it up after reading it. Any words? Nora shut her eyes a second, summoning memory. Only one line, because she repeated it in that flat way she had when something truly disturbed her. She said, "Some smiles stay behind longer than marriages do." That sat there and made weather, I asked. And yesterday, Nora said. Yesterday, just before the photograph. She looked toward the mantel, not at the portrait, at the silver frame. I thought she was checking her hair by reflection, the way women do when they're tired of being looked at directly. But when the photographer made his little joke and Julian turned to smile, Lila changed only for a second. She had seen something. The woman, yes, or recognized her. That was the first clean nail. I asked where Nora had been standing. She showed me, and her position matched the line of sight from which Lila could have caught the frame's reflection, while Nora could not. That pleased me professionally and irritated me personally, because it made the sequence even clearer. Lila saw the stranger in silver before the shutter clicked, and whatever happened afterward began not with disappearance, but with recognition. When I left Nora, I had the shape but not the name, so I went after the house. Celia Brent was in the blue drawing room giving battle to the flowers by looking at them as if they had personally invited disgrace. She was too intelligent to waste time pretending surprise when I asked whether any woman connected with the family might be called returned from years ago. No one respectable, she said. That excludes half the city and most of your family. Narrow it. She gave me a level look. There was once a woman named Miriam Voss. Aunts. She was companion to my mother in the last years. Then she left or was made to leave. The exact version depends on who is narrating and how badly they wish to preserve the upholstery. That was good enough to sit down for. Why was she made to leave? Because my brother Adrian dislikes uninvited loyalties in a house, and because Lila's mother trusted Miriam Voss more than was convenient. That's almost a motive. It was only inconvenience then. Later, it may have become memory. I asked what Miriam Voss looked like. Dark, narrow, habitually in black, fond of hats even indoors, because she believed overhead light was an assault on the forehead. Not beautiful, distinct, and gone these 12 years. Dead? I asked. Number only removed. Who removed her? Celia's mouth thinned. Adrian handled it. That went into the book. Adrian Harrow did not enjoy our next conversation, which was why it improved. Miriam Voss, he said. That is absurd. Number, it is a name. Whether it embarrasses you is secondary. She was my sister, in-laws paid companion, nothing more. And then she left, voluntarily. He made the mistake of answering too neatly, yes. That means no. His face hardened. Mr. Goodwin, you are a guest in my house. Number, I'm a response to your house. That landed because it was true, I pressed. She knew Lila as a child. Yes, she had access to the rooms. The habits, the old portrait, the silver, the side passage, and your family's talent for keeping women in the margins until they become inconvenient. He said nothing. That too went into the book. By lunch I had enough to return to Wolf with appetite for both facts and food. He was in the office, naturally, looking as though he had spent the morning among orchids improving his opinion of vegetation at the expense of humanity. Fritz had just set coffee at his elbow, which is as near to divine arrangement as our house comes below the plant rooms. "Well," he said. I gave him Nora Elwell first. Lila not joyful but interrupted, uneasy for a week. Mention of someone returning from years ago. A torn note with the line about smiles outlasting marriages. Lila glancing toward the silver frame before the photograph and recognizing something in it. Then Celia Brent, Miriam Voss, former companion to Lila's mother. Dark, narrow, hat indoors, trusted too much, removed 12 years earlier by Adrian Harrow's management. Then Adrian's discomfort, which had the flavor of old domestic inconvenience, gone stale into danger. When I finished, Wolf shut his eyes. "At last," he said, "the disappearance begins behaving. That's encouraging. Number it is merely less vulgar. Miss Harrow's vanishing was not the first event. It was the last. Before that came the note, the return, the recognition, and the family's selective memory. Good. I'm beginning to dislike that word. You are too impressionable." He opened one eye. "Archie, find Miriam Voss. That may be difficult after 12 years. Number after 12 years, it is merely New York." He sipped coffee and added, "Also, the line about smiles is not poetry, it is accusation. The past entered the room before the disappearance. Now locate the door it used." That sent me back out again, because in our line of work, the city is not so much a setting as a filing system with traffic. Latter standing at my window after dark with the wet street below making its usual bargain with taxi lamps. I thought about Lila Harrow's face in the photograph. Nora had been right. She did not look joyous. She looked interrupted, not by nerves, not by champagne, not even by the burden of being watched in ivory satin by people who had already judged her prospects like a racehorse. She had looked into the silver frame, seen the reflected woman, and recognized something long enough feared and never settled. That is when the case began, not when she vanished. When the past looked back at her from polished silver, and she knew it had found her before the room did. Chapter 4. The house that watched itself. There are houses in New York that merely shelter people, and there are houses that cooperate with them. The Harrow place on East 64th belonged to the second class. It had been built in the era when rich men believed privacy could be solved by architecture, and then improved, altered, extended, softened, divided, and disguised by later generations, until it had acquired the one trait every detective distrusts on sight: too many ways of being occupied. Wolf understood that before he saw the floor plan. When I got back from my talk with Nora Elwell, and my less profitable one with Adrian Harrow, he had Fritz bring coffee and the house blueprints, or rather the nearest thing to them that a respectable family will admit exists after a century of additions. Adrian had sent them over under protest, which in itself improved their value. Wolf spread them on his desk and examined them as if the architect had committed a private offense. "Photograhy," he said. "That could describe most housing in Manhattan. Number this is worse. It is deliberate comfort in alliance with concealment." He tapped one long finger against the page. "Archie, find out whether the house contains service passages still in use. Old corridor doors disguised as paneling, terrace entries, dressing room connections, and any blind angles by which a person familiar with the place could cross from private rooms to public rooms unseen." That sounds like half the novels in circulation. Yes, which is why I wish facts instead. So I went back to East 64th, with architecture on my mind and mistrust in good order. Adrian Harrow received me in the library and did not pretend pleasure this time. That was an economy. I appreciate economy when it is not mine. "You wish more of the house," he said. "Yes, you have already had too much of it." "Not enough. If Lila vanished inside it, the walls are now material witnesses." He disliked that and therefore let me proceed. Men who feel proprietary toward houses often resent their conversion into evidence. It is one of the few democratic pleasures in my work. Harrow House was large enough to hide movement, and old enough to remember secrets. That was plain before I had gone 10 steps past the main stair. There were front rooms for display, middle rooms for qualified intimacy, rear rooms for management, upper floors for family, lower passages for servants, and the usual half-dozen compromises by which domestic life admits that people want both privacy and supervision and are willing to pay handsomely for the contradiction. Mrs. Cormack, the housekeeper, gave me the practical tour because housekeepers always know more about a building than the bloodline that struts through it. She was broad, composed, and armed with the look women acquire after 30 years of tidying rich people's carelessness into presentable routine. There are plenty. She showed me. From the blue drawing room, a side passage led not only to the music room and card salon, but to a narrower service hall disguised by paneling, where one door matched the wall so exactly that I had gone past it twice the previous evening without noticing. That hall connected with the back stair, the butler's pantry, a small anteroom behind the library, and the former morning room service entrance. Upstairs, there were communicating doors between dressing rooms, built in an age when ladies required maids and plausible deniability in equal measure. On the second floor, a linen corridor ran behind the principal bedrooms and allowed servants to cross without entering the main hall. On the third, old nursery passages had been preserved and repurposed as storage, but still connected two wings of the house if one knew which little latch to lift. Agnon, who grew up here, would know all this, I said. Yes, Agnon long employed. Yes, Agnon once intimate with the family and later omitted from conversation. That got the smallest pause, which in a housekeeper is often worth a notarized statement. Yes, she said. We were in the narrow hall behind the blue drawing room then, near the disguised panel door. From there I could see exactly what the silver frame had caught. A woman standing half in shadow at the angle where the passage widened could be reflected in the mantel silver and go unnoticed by a room facing inward toward the couple. The place had been built to separate traffic by class and purpose, but all such separations eventually become opportunities. If you know which door does not announce itself and which corner does not belong to the guests, you can appear where you should not have been and be taken for furniture by anyone not trained to mistrust walls. I said, no guest should have been standing here. Mrs. Cormack nodded. No, invited guest. That was better. Yet someone could stand here without trespass if the house had once taught her the path. Yes, Miriam Voss. Mrs. Cormack looked at me directly. You have the name already. I make a hobby of the omitted. She considered, then said, Miss Voss was companion to Mrs. Harrow. Years ago she knew every room worth knowing and several not worth admitting. Mrs. Harrow trusted her. Mr. Adrian did not. Why not? Because she observed too much and ranked money after loyalty, which is never popular in houses that prefer the reverse. That was neat enough to frame. She showed me the upper route next. From Lila's room, a person could exit by the main hall or by the dressing room connection to the old guest suite. From there to the linen corridor, and from there to the rear stair, without crossing the family landing. The arrangement had once been for maids and propriety. Now it was a map for disappearance. Did Lila know these ways? I asked. She grew up here. Did Julian Fisk? Number did Nora Elwell? Not all. Miriam Voss. A look. That was the sentence I had come for, and because it had been given in a plain voice without embroidery, I trusted it more than if it had arrived sealed with family wax. I spent an hour making the house confess by geometry. From the blue drawing room to the side hall, from the side hall to the concealed service door, from there to the back stair, from the back stair to the upper linen corridor, from there to Lila's floor, and back again by the old schoolroom turn that opened behind the portrait gallery. It could all be done quietly, rapidly, and without setting one foot where a guest or a footman, expecting guests, might think to look. The reflection in the silver frame had not shown an intruder who had broken in. It had shown someone moving through familiarity. That is different. Burglars watch locks. The familiar watch timing. Adrian Harrow joined me in the portrait gallery, while I was proving that a person descending from the second floor by the rear stair could reach the blue drawing room passage in under 90 seconds if she knew which runner on the corridor squeaked and which one merely complained. "You are turning my home into a diagram," he said. Number it was already one. I am only adding labels. He disliked that, which made it useful. "Miss Voss knew the house," I said. "Yes, and would know where she could stand unseen." "Yes. And if Lila saw her in the silver reflection, she would understand at once not merely who it was, but how she had got there." "Yes." That third yes cost him more than the others. I turned. "Mr. Harrow, you told me yesterday that Miriam Voss had simply left. Mrs. Cormack tells me you distrusted her because your sister-in-law trusted her too much. That suggests departure by management, not whim." He kept his face under control, but his eyes admitted the strain. She had become unsuitable. That is family speech for inconvenient. It is family speech for dangerous. That improved the room by darkening it. In what way? She encouraged Lila's mother to oppose certain settlements after my brother's death. What settlements? Financial, domestic, matters concerning guardianship and administration. And Lila's. She was a child. "Children grow," I said, "and some of them remember faces." He did not answer. That too helped. I went next to Martin Dace, the family secretary, who occupied a small office behind the library, and smelled faintly of ink, dust, and defensive wording. He was exactly the sort of man houses breed when they need letters answered without conscience, entering the ribbon. "Miss Voss," I said. He blinked, then corrected his face too late. "What of her?" "She knew the house." "Yes. She left under cloud." "That is theatrical. So is disappearance." He did not enjoy that. "Good." I asked him whether the old passages remained in use. He said yes for service, rarely for family, which is a lie such houses tell themselves to remain morally upholstered. He admitted Miss Voss would have known every turn of them. He denied seeing her for years. He denied hearing her name recently. He denied enough to make me suspect at least one of those denials had been instructed from above. By the time I returned to West 35th, the city had reached that pale, dirty hour when daylight begins thinking about surrender, but has not yet found a proper reason. Wolf was in the office, with the plans still spread on his desk and one hand resting on them, as if on the carcass of a defeated beast. "Well," he said. I gave him the house in order. Hidden corridors, servant passages, communicating dressing room doors, blind angles near the blue drawing room, a concealed panel opening into the very passage reflected in the silver frame, rear stair access from upper floors without crossing public halls, a complete route by which a person familiar with the house could appear and vanish while the guests drank to the future. Mrs. Cormack confirming that Miriam Voss knew every one of those ways. Adrian admitting she had become dangerous in old family settlement matters. Martin Dace lying by economy. When I finished, Wolf shut his eyes. "Yes, that word again," the house assisted, he said. "That is the essential fact. The reflected woman did not intrude by force. She moved through permission once granted, and perhaps never fully revoked. The architecture concealed her because it had been built to conceal movement generally. Thus the family became accomplice by inheritance." I sat down. That sounds almost legal. It is architectural, which is often worse. A house with passages trains its occupants in selective sight. They cease to notice where people may be because they have learned too well where people should not be. Therefore, Miss Voss, if it was she, did not break in. She moved in an old grammar. That was good enough to keep. "So Lila sees her in the silver frame," I said, "recognizes not only the face but the path, and knows at once the past has entered the house by a route that means familiarity, not chance." "Yes, and vanishing follows." "No," Wolf said, "vanishing completes." "Do not lapse backward," the sequence began earlier. Note, fear, expectation, reflection, recognition. The disappearance is still the last event. That was why he is Wolf, and I merely feed him facts until he starts making laws out of them. At the door he stopped me with one more. "Archie." "Yes, houses are conservative. They preserve not merely furniture and passages, but permissions. Ask now, who allowed Miriam Voss to move through them once, and who feared what she had seen while doing so? That stayed with me later when I was at my window with the street below, reflecting lamps in broken gold and every taxi hurrying to a truth. It would not keep. Harrow House had done what many old houses do. It had mistaken secrecy for dignity and convenience for innocence. Hidden doors, side corridors, blind angles, servant routes, all of it built to make life easier, and later serving the commoner purpose of making lies move quietly from one room to another. The woman in the silver frame had not slipped into the house like a thief. She had crossed it like memory, along paths the building had never forgotten, even after the family tried to. Chapter 5. The man she agreed to marry by 4 that afternoon. I had reached the point in the case where everybody was either too calm or not calm enough, and both conditions were beginning to look taxable. Wolf, after hearing my report on Harrow House and its architectural conscience, had sent me out again with one of those remarks that sound casual until you discover it has done half the work already. Archie the fiancé, Julian Fisk, number Edwin Vale. I stared at him. He opened one eye. You are inattentive. I am overworked. Photograhy, Mr. Adrian Harrow said the engagement was to Julian Fisk. Mrs. Cormack, in your report, referred to old settlement disputes among the Vales. Miss Nora Elwell spoke of arrangement rather than affection. You have either been given a false name, or there are 2 men in the field, and the wrong one has occupied too much of your attention. Correct it. That is Wolf. He hears one inconsistency while I am still polishing the previous paragraph. So I corrected it. The correction came quickly enough to annoy me. Julian Fisk was merely one more polished man in the room, close enough to the center of things to be mistaken for importance if you weren't watching carefully. In the confusion of the previous evening, with people answering too fast and grief improvising manners badly, I had accepted the wrong man under the wrong title. Adrian Harrow had not exactly lied. He had allowed the room to misdirect itself, which in my trade counts as social theft. By 5, I was in a private office on Madison Avenue, looking at Edwin Vale, the man Lila had actually agreed to marry. He was 34, tall, neat, dark-haired, and one of those men whose composure has been ironed so often it no longer shows seams. His office was tastefully expensive in the modern way, pale wood, discreet carpets, one abstract painting trying to justify itself, and windows high enough to suggest ambition, but not high enough to prove it. The desk held no disorder. Men who truly work hard usually have some paper somewhere that resents them. Edwin Vale had the desk of a man who prefers management to labor and knows the difference. He rose when I was shown in. Mr. Goodwin. Mr. Vale, I understand you wish to speak with me before returning to Mr. Wolf. Yes, it saves wear on the truth if I get it near the source. He offered me a chair. I took it, though not with gratitude, and watched him resume his own place behind the desk. He sat carefully, not stiffly. That matters. Stiff men are often frightened. Careful men are usually dangerous in slower ways. First, I let him correct the public record. I gather, he said, that there was some confusion last night. Lila Harrow and I were engaged. Julian Fisk was merely standing nearest when things went wrong. He often is, socially. That was generous of you. It was accurate. Yes, accuracy has made a late appearance in this case. I'm encouraging it. He accepted that with a small movement of the mouth that might have become a smile if he had practiced at lower stakes. Edwin Vale belonged to finance in the modern tidy sense. Investment structures, advisory positions, board seats, trust administration. The sort of work where men speak softly, because shouting would make the percentages look vulgar. He had old ties to the Harrows through family memorial matters and newer ones through business. The engagement had been announced after, by his account, a gradual understanding. That phrase deserved surveillance. How gradual? I asked. 6 months. Courtship, in a civilized form. That usually means supervised. His eyes sharpened slightly. Mr. Goodwin, I admired Lila very much. Past tense already, that's thrifty. I am trying to remain exact. Number, you are trying to remain controlled. Exact comes later. He let that pass because he was too disciplined to waste energy on vanity while a fiancée was missing, or because he knew vanity had never been the safest room in the house to enter with me. I asked him whether Lila had seemed happy. He did not say yes at once. That helped. She had been distant, he said, in recent weeks. Why, I don't know. That answer is fashionable, but rarely durable. His fingers moved once on the blotter and then were still. Lila was not a transparent woman, Mr. Goodwin. She had moods. She also had a family with a long habit of making private matters public and public matters ornamental. That's good. You may keep it. Thank you. Did she want to marry you? Yes, he said. Easily. A pause. Not easily. That's better. Continue. He took a breath. The engagement was suitable. There, that word. I was waiting for it. It was not a commercial arrangement. No, I said. Only an emotional merger under favorable terms. That annoyed him, which was useful. She liked me, he said. That sounds like a dividend. I cared for her. Did you love her? He looked at me directly. I intended to make a good life with her. That was a no dressed in proper linen, I said. Mr. Vale, you wanted stability more than affection. This time his face changed enough to earn the sentence. I wanted peace, he said. From what? He said nothing. I waited, because silence can be either a refusal or a door. This one was a door deciding whether it respected me enough to open. At Harrow House, he said at last. Peace is not sentimental, it is practical. Lila needed distance from old family tensions. I could provide that. Distance from what exactly? From dependence. From old grievances. From the habit that house has of making women answer to history. That was better than I expected, and therefore suspicious in a more refined way. You speak like a man who has watched her carefully. I had, yet when I ask why she was distant, you claim no reason. He looked out toward the window for a second and then back. Because the reason she gave, and the reason I believed, may not have been the same. I sat straighter. Now we're spending money. He did not smile. 3 weeks ago, Lila told me she felt something unfinished in the house had begun again. Miriam Voss. That hit him. Not hard, but enough to make his eyes declare temporary bankruptcy. So you know the name, he said. Yes. She did not say it to me. She didn't need to. He let that go because there was no profit in contesting it. Lila had grown uneasy after finding some old letters among her mother's things. She thought someone had lied to her about the circumstances under which Miss Voss left. Did you? Did you care? Yes, that's new. He ignored it. I cared because Lila's imagination was becoming involved. No, I said. Because the past had started threatening the future you had arranged, that landed where it should. You think me cold, he said. I think you orderly. It is much more common and often more damaging. He sat with that a moment. Then he said, if you mean to ask whether I would have married her despite distress over old family matters. Yes, certainly. Marriage resolves many unnecessary agitations. That's the line. What line? The one that tells me exactly what sort of man I'm speaking to. I let him keep the silence a moment, then went on. The engagement was swift. 6 months in a family like that is swift. It was acceptable. Again that word. Acceptable to whom? To Adrian Harrow, certainly. To the family solicitor, to Lila's aunt, probably to the investment climate that almost got a smile out of him, which I resented because it improved him. You had business ties to the Harrows already. Yes. Through Adrian. Yes. Through old Vale family trust matters. Yes. And through whatever domestic embarrassment Miriam Voss represented. That came too clean. I marked it. What did Lila say last night before the photograph? He answered carefully that she was tired. Of the guests, of being displayed. That's a sound complaint. She also asked whether I believed the dead remained where they had been put. I stared. That is not an engagement sentence. What did you say? That I believed the living moved the dead around to suit themselves. That was a good answer, and I disliked him for having made it. What did she say then? He looked down at his hands. She said, then perhaps this house has been rearranging the wrong woman for years. That one went straight into the book and deserved underlining. So there it was, Lila distant, uneasy, recognizing something in the house had returned. Edwin Vale calm, composed, and deeply concerned, but not surprised enough. Not surprised by her distress, not surprised by old family trouble reviving, perhaps not even surprised that the engagement had been built on unstable ground. Men like Edwin do not necessarily commit crimes. Often they only marry into them with excellent posture, and the belief that stability can be erected over any amount of unresolved truth, if the lawyers are expensive enough. I got up, he said. You think badly of me. I think clearly of you. Which is worse? Yes. At the door I turned. Mr. Vale, one more thing. If Miriam Voss returned, where would she go first in that house? He answered too fast to be invented. To Lila. That was worth the entire interview. Back on West 35th, Wolf took the report in his office, while Fritz moved in the hall beyond, with the moral force of a man preparing dinner for a civilization not quite deserving it. I gave him Edwin Vale entire, calm, controlled, concerned, and too little surprised. 6-month courtship, described as civilized and suitable. Affection subordinate to peace. Business ties to Adrian and the Harrow property concerns. Lila distant in recent weeks. Old letters of her mother's stirring the Miriam Voss question. Lila speaking of something unfinished returning. Lila's last strange sentence about the house, rearranging the wrong woman. Edwin's immediate answer that Miriam, if back, would go first to Lila. When I finished, Wolf shut his eyes. Yes, that word again. You continue to earn it irregularly. He opened one eye. Mr. Edwin Vale wanted stability. Stability is not love, it is architecture. He intended marriage as a solution to disorder. Such men are dangerous not because they murder, but because they underestimate what disorder already knows. That sounds expensive. It is free, you merely listen badly. I ignored that because habit is not the same as resignation, though they are cousins. So Edwin Vale is not our simplest villain. He did not display sufficient surprise, because Miss Harrow's unease was not news to him. He knew the engagement rested upon unsettled domestic history and proceeded because he believed structure could absorb revelation. That may be foolish, but it is not yet murderous. Not yet. Also, note his last answer. If Miriam Voss returned, she would go first to Lila. Therefore Miss Harrow was the central point, not merely of the engagement, but of the past. That was why he is Wolf, and I do the shoe leather. Later at my window again with the city below, making light look temporary, I thought about Edwin Vale, the sort of man who would not push a woman into marriage, exactly, but would stand very still beside the proper future until she grew tired enough to mistake his steadiness for safety. Calm, composed, concerned, wanting not passion but peace, not affection, but settlement. And that can be worse, because sometimes the truth does not erupt under hatred. Sometimes it rises under arrangements built too carefully over what should have been left exposed. Chapter 6. The friend who noticed too much. Friends are dangerous in family cases for 2 reasons. First, they know which lies are decorative and which are load-bearing. Second, they often mistake loyalty for silence and silence for virtue, which is how a perfectly decent girl can become an accessory to 3 generations of nonsense, without so much as receiving a decent hat for it. By the time I turned back to Nora Kent, I had Edwin Vale in one pocket, Miriam Voss in the other, and Lila Harrow's last known sentences making trouble in the middle. That is never a comfortable arrangement. Wolf had listened to my report on Vale from the red leather chair with the sort of stillness that means his mind is doing construction work with facts, while mine is still looking for nails. Then he said, Archie, the friend, Nora Kent. Yes. She noticed too much and admitted too little. That could describe half Manhattan. Half Manhattan notices too little and admits too much. Miss Kent is of a superior variety return. So I returned. The Harrow house in daylight had settled into that strained after-condition wealthy houses get when scandal has stayed overnight without paying. The flowers had begun to look self-conscious. The servants moved as if every tray might be subpoenaed. In the front hall, a footman had acquired the expression of a man who knew he would later describe this week as the one that drove him into business school. Nora Kent was in the morning room again, though not by the window this time. She was at a small writing table with a stack of cards before her and no ink on the pen, which is how women of good training look busy while trying not to think. When she saw me, she did not start, which told me she had expected I would be back and had perhaps spent the intervening hours deciding which version of the truth would injure the fewest people. That is never the version I want, Mr. Goodwin, Miss Kent. She looked at the blank cards. I suppose this means I was not sufficient yesterday. No one ever is. It keeps the city employed. That got the smallest shadow of a smile, not because she was amused, but because she needed something in the room not to be family. I sat opposite her and waited. Silence properly used is not an absence. It is a bill presented without itemization. She understood that well enough. After perhaps 10 seconds, she said, "You have found out more." Yes, about Lila. About everybody. It makes Lila more central, not less. Her fingers touched the edge of the cards and then withdrew. She had pretty hands in the nervous, overbred style, and they were doing too much work for a woman who claimed to know only what she had already told me. I said, "You were the last person to speak to her before she vanished." "Yes." "That makes you valuable. It also makes me tired." "That's not a defense." "Number." She looked up. "What do you want?" "The second conversation." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "What second conversation?" "The one you omitted yesterday because you decided it belonged to Lila and not to me." That hit. Not hard. Enough. There was only the one. Number, there was the social one and the real one. Lila was photographed. The room laughed politely. She looked toward the silver frame. Then she spoke to you, or near enough, because you were standing at her left. "Give me that." Nora held herself still. Then, because stillness can only serve as refusal for so long before it becomes a confession in another outfit, she gave way. She said, "There she is." I nodded. "And you?" I asked. "Who?" And she. "The woman who was never gone," she said. "That settled in the room like something with title to the furniture," I said. "You knew who she meant." Nora's mouth tightened, I guessed. Number, she met my eyes. "Yes, that was better." "Tell me." She meant Miriam Voss, because she had spoken of her before. "Yes." "How often?" "3 times in the last month, once lightly, twice not." I let that sit for a second because with friends, it is never only what they say, but how long they have been deciding not to say it. "You told me yesterday about someone returning from years ago," I said. "You did not tell me you had a name." She did not speak it the first time, then the second. Nora nodded. She found a packet of letters among her mother's things. I don't know where exactly. A writing box, perhaps. One of those places families keep dead women flattened and ribboned. She read them and came to me 3 days later in a state I would not call panic. No. Number, panic is louder. This was recognition. That was the word I wanted, and because she had chosen it herself, I trusted it. She said she now understood that her mother had not dismissed Miriam Voss. Miriam had been forced out, and not because of impropriety as the family always implied, but because she knew something. "What?" Nora shook her head. "Lila never told me exactly. Or perhaps she did, and I refused to hear the exact shape, because it made the room uglier. That's honest. It is useless. Number, useless people never know when they are protecting ugliness." That startled her. "Good. A startled witness is often a useful one," I said. "Yesterday, after she saw the reflection, fear. Yes. Panic. Numbered. Difference." Nora leaned back and looked toward the shuttered window, as if the answer might be safer there. "Panic is when danger begins. This was when danger became familiar. That was very good." I disliked her a little for making me admire it. She wasn't frightened of being attacked. Nora went on. She was frightened of being right. About Miriam. Yes, about what Miriam's presence meant. I asked, what did it mean? That the family had lied, that her mother's marriage had not been what she had been told, that Adrian had controlled more than finances, that some old arrangement involving loyalty and silence had been kept buried under all the proper silver and memorial phrases. That matched too much to be accidental and too little to be enough, I pressed. Why did you say the reflection meant nothing? She looked at me sharply. When did I say that? Last night to Adrian. In the library, when he asked whether anyone recognized the woman, you said, "It may be a servant's distortion. These things happen in silver." Color touched her face then, not much but enough to mark the hit. I was trying to prevent chaos. Number, you were trying to prevent one specific kind of chaos. Yes, she said. Because if I had said the name Miriam Voss in that room, Adrian would have shut the house like a fist. There it was. And you didn't want that because Lila was already gone. And if Miriam had come back after all these years, then whatever she wanted had not yet happened, or not yet finished. I thought naming her too soon would make everyone stupid at once. That was possible. It was also clever, and I had begun to suspect Nora Kent of a quality the family undervalued because it came in a pretty container. I said, "You watched the photograph like memory." She did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at the print, which I had laid face down on the table between us before beginning. She turned it over with one finger and looked at the reflected woman again. "Yes," she said quietly, "because I had seen that hat before." That widened the room another yard. Where? In a drawer in Lila's mother's old dressing room, years ago. We were 15, perhaps, playing archaeological ruin among dead woman's things. There was a hat box and a little net veil, and Lila said, "That was Miriam's, not Mama's." Then she laughed and put it away as if it meant nothing. Last night, in the reflection, the line of the brim was the same. Well, that was not nothing. Why didn't you tell me this yesterday? Because yesterday, I still thought Lila might have gone upstairs, hidden herself, fled to punish Edwin Vale, or done any of the ordinary absurd things unhappy women do when surrounded by family arrangements. Today I think less well of ordinary explanations. That was progress. I approved of it. I asked the question Wolf would have asked and hated me for not asking first. Did Lila ever speak of leaving Edwin? Nora's eyes came back to mine at once. Number, did she love him? She wanted to. That's not love. Number, but it is often what women are allowed to call it. Again, very good. She liked his steadiness, Nora said. She mistrusted his composure. She said once that Edwin Vale had the soul of a locked desk, reassuring if you wished to put papers in it, less so if you expected warmth. I wrote that down because it belonged in a better novel than most people get. But the engagement went forward anyway, I said. Yes, because everyone approved, because Lila was tired, because peace can look like affection if you've lived long enough in a room with raised voices that never quite become open war. There it was again, arrangement, not romance. I got up and went to the mantel mirror at the far end of the morning room, then turned back to her. Miss Kent, there are people who hide secrets because the secrets are theirs, and people who carry them because they belong to someone else, and no one else can be trusted not to drop them. Which are you? That took a second. Then she said, Both. Probably. I believed her. Did Lila leave with Miriam Voss? I don't know. Did she mean to? I don't know. Did she fear her? Number, that one came clean. She feared what Miriam's return proved, Nora said. Not Miriam herself. That I believed absolutely. When I left her, I had the shape of something Wolf would like. Fear without panic. Recognition instead of surprise. A returned woman connected to the dead mother, a friend carrying more than one person's silence. And a photograph watched not as evidence, but as memory developing in public. Back on West 35th, Wolf was in the office where God and reason intended him, and I gave him Nora entire. Last to speak to Lila, heard the words, "There she is." Knew at once that Miriam Voss was meant. held back the name to prevent Adrian from sealing the house and blundering over whatever remained unfinished. Admitted seeing the reflected hat as one she remembered from Lila's mother's old things. Distinguished fear from panic and recognition from danger. Confirmed that Lila had feared being right more than being attacked. Confirmed also that the engagement had been peace. Driven, not joy. Driven, which matched Edwin Vale too well for comfort. When I finished, Wolf had his eyes shut. "Yes," he said, "you are going to wear that word out. Number you are merely late in understanding its economies." He opened one eye. "Miss Kent carries secrets for others. That makes her useful and dangerous, but not yet culpable. More important, Miss Harrow feared the return not of Miriam Voss as person, but of what her return established as fact. Therefore the disappearance still follows recognition and does not precede it." "I know. The vanishing was the last event." "Yes." He took up his beer and put it down untasted. Also, Nora Kent delayed naming Miriam because she knew Adrian Harrow would react not with grief, but with management. That is revealing. "So Adrian still rises in your affections." "Phoo." He leaned back. "Next, Archie, find the mother. She's dead. Number find her in the papers, letters, settlements and memories. Miriam Voss did not return for Miss Harrow's engagement. She returned for whatever was left unfinished in Mrs. Harrow's life. That was enough to keep the evening busy later. At my window again with the city below, making sound without saying anything useful, I thought about Nora Kent. She had watched the photograph, not the way one watches a clue, but the way one watches a memory that has suddenly acquired witnesses. That is different. A clue startles, a memory accuses. There are people who hide secrets for themselves, and people who carry them for others until the weight alters their spine. Nora was doing both, and doing it with enough grace to be mistaken for mere nerves by anybody less suspicious than I am. Lila Harrow had not vanished because danger arrived suddenly. She had vanished because something she had already feared had at last stepped into view and stood still long enough to be reflected. Chapter 7. The photograph that changed shape. Photographs have two virtues and one vice. They keep what people fail to notice, and they keep it without argument. The vice is that they do not explain themselves, which leaves the explanation to men like Wolf and me, and occasionally to policemen, which is less satisfactory. The print from the Harrow engagement had by then become the most unpopular object in the house. That is usually a good sign. If everybody dislikes a thing, it is almost always telling the truth in an inconvenient tone. I had taken the photograph back to West 35th, the night before, and Wolf had looked at it once, grunted, and told me to bring a magnifying glass from the drawer he reserves, for facts that require enlargement before they can insult him properly. He had then held the print under the desk lamp, studied the silver frame reflection, and said, "Archie, it has not changed shape. Your understanding of it has." That is the sort of remark I get paid not enough to hear. By morning, after coffee and one exchange with Fritz, in which he implied that photography had been a mistake from the start, and all modern methods should be boiled, I had the print again, and was back at Harrow House to compare image with room, angle with angle, and house with its own bad habits. Adrian Harrow tried to stop me at the library door. Again. "Yes, you have already seen the room." That was before the photograph improved. He looked at the print in my hand, as if it had spread gossip about him personally. What now? Now I see what it was actually reflecting. That unsettled him, which meant I was near a useful piece of architecture. The blue drawing room was empty and coldly handsome in the morning light, without candles and guests and false congratulations. It looked what it was, a room made to hold people in patterns. I stood where the photographer had stood, set the print against the mantel, and let the room correct my memory. The reflected woman had first seemed merely a dark figure in the side opening. Under closer inspection, she had begun behaving less like an accident and more like intention. Her posture was wrong for casual observation. She was not turned toward the room generally. She was aligned toward Lila, even in reflection, even in silver. That much was plain now. The chin was angled not toward the guests, Not toward the photographer, not toward Edwin Vale, but toward the precise place where Lila had stood. She had not been watching the engagement. She had been watching Lila. That improved the case and worsened the family. I moved 3 feet left, then 2 right, then backed into the side passage itself. There is an advantage in treating a room like a lyre. If you approach it from the wrong direction, it will satisfy you. If you approach it from the right one, it eventually becomes tired and gives way. Mrs. Cormack, the housekeeper, entered while I was half-turned with the print in one hand and my nose nearly in the panel molding. "Should I ask?" "None, it would slow us both." She looked at the print, then at the passage. "You've found something?" "Yes, or it has grown tired of not being found." I showed her. "Look at the woman's shoulders," I said. "No drift, no uncertainty. She is fixed on one point." Mrs. Cormack peered, frowned, and then did what all good housekeepers do when they have decided a thing is fact. She accepted it without embroidery. "She's watching Miss Lila." "Yes. Not the room. Number. That's worse." "Yes." She looked into the side passage then, and because she knew the house better than the family did, her face altered first. "The panel," she said exactly. The reflection showed, just behind the woman's right shoulder, not merely shadow, but a narrow vertical line where the passage panel stood a fraction ajar. Not enough to announce itself to the room, enough to show in polished silver where edges become talkative. The stranger had not been standing in the open doorway at all. She had been at the concealed service, panel entrance off the narrow passage. That changed the house. I put the print against the wall and touched the panel in question. It was the same disguised door Mrs. Cormack had shown me earlier, the one leading from the visible side corridor into the service passage. When closed, it vanished into molding. When open a fraction, it made precisely the slim dark seam the silver reflection had caught. "Then she entered from there," Mrs. Cormack said. "Yes, no guest would know that door. No invited guest. That got us farther. From the service side, a person could approach the panel, open it an inch, see into the blue drawing room through the crack, and if she chose, step just enough into the angle to be reflected in the mantel silver without exposing herself fully to anyone in the room. It was a trick of house geometry, old privilege, and selective sight. The sort of trick only a woman, familiar with the house, would dare. He opened the panel fully and stepped through. The service corridor behind it was narrow, carpetless, practical, and invisible in the way old houses make utility disappear behind politeness. From there, one could go rearward to the pantry stair, or upward by the back flight to the bedroom corridor, or one could wait. That was the important part. A person could stand there for 10 seconds, 20, a minute, listening to the room beyond breathe, and laugh, and congratulate itself, and then choose precisely when to appear or not appear. The photograph had changed shape because we had finally asked it the right question. Not who is she, where is she standing, and why there. I went upstairs next because if the hidden panel gave me entry, the answer still needed motive, and motive in this house had been living on the second floor, under lock, silver, backed brushes, and family management. Lila's room was as I had left it, though the air had changed. Rooms do that when their owners are gone. They become not emptier, but more exact, as if every object has been promoted from use to testimony. On the dressing table lay the little silver, backed hand mirror I had glanced at before, and ignored because it seemed only decorative. Now I picked it up and saw, on the reverse, a faint engraving nearly worn smooth. MV that gave me a moment's satisfaction, immediately followed by annoyance for not having seen it sooner. I took it downstairs. Celia Brent was in the morning room, and Edwin Vale was with her, because apparently neither had enough sense to avoid one another during scandal. Edwin rose when he saw the mirror in my hand. "What is that?" "A better question than most you've offered." Celia took one look and said, "Oh, that is one of the most useful female syllables in existence." "You recognize it?" I said. Yes, it was Miriam Voss's, or had been. My sister, in-law, kept it after Miriam left. A sentimental gesture, or a guilty one, Depending on your mood, Widwin Vale said. Why would Lila have it? Because it was in her mother's things, I said. Like the letters, like the old hat box, like every other family omission that was too expensive to throw away and too inconvenient to explain. He did not like that because it was right. I put the mirror beside the photograph on the table between us. The reflected woman was not watching the room. She was watching Lila. She stood at the concealed panel entrance, which means she knew the hidden way, and Lila, before the shutter clicked, looked toward the silver frame and recognized her. Widwin said, "Recognized what?" Miriam Voss herself. That, I said, remains the expensive part. Celia Brent looked at the mirror, not at me. Lila had been reading too much dead truth, yes. And you think the woman came for her? Yes. No, said Edwin. That came too quickly. I turned to him, no. I think Lila went to her. There, no one spoke for a second because sometimes truth doesn't arrive with trumpets. It just says something half the room has been refusing to think, because thinking it would disturb the upholstery, I said. You knew more than you've said. He looked at the photograph as if it might negotiate on his behalf. I knew only that if Miriam returned, Lila would not run from her. That was not enough, but it was better than what I had before. Back on West 35th, Wolf had the print under the lamp, before I had fully taken off my coat. I gave him the panel seam in the reflection, the posture fixed on Lila, the service corridor route, and the silver-backed mirror engraved MV. He listened, then held the photograph nearer the light. Yes, he said. I waited. At last he looked up. The reflected woman watched Miss Harrow specifically and positioned herself at the hidden panel. Therefore, she intended not to observe generally, but to signal privately. Miss Harrow recognized both the figure and the route. Good. That word again. Be quiet, Archie. The question now is not how the stranger entered. We know that. The question is why Miss Harrow, seeing her, chose to vanish rather than cry out. That is the greater one. Yes, he set the print down. Recognition without alarm means relationship. Fear, yes, shock, yes, but not immediate danger in the physical sense. Miss Harrow saw someone she believed she must follow, face, or hear. Miriam Voss, perhaps, or someone using her old grammar. That was Wolf at his least charitable and most useful. Just when a case begins offering neat names, he distrusts them on principle. Later, at my window, I thought about the photograph and how it had changed shape in the mind, not on paper. First, it had shown a stranger, then a watcher placed exactly where no guest belonged, and every insider might pass unnoticed. And now it showed something worse than intrusion. It showed intention directed at one woman in one room at one instant. The house had yielded the route. The photograph had yielded the stance. But the hardest part remained untouched. Why Lila Harrow, seeing that reflected woman, had not raised the room with one word, and instead had left it altogether. Chapter 8, the name no one used anymore by that stage of the case. The Harrow family had begun behaving as good families always do when the past starts opening drawers on its own. They denied selectively, remembered decorously, and produced facts only after the facts had become too inconvenient to keep. It is an old trick. The trouble is that old tricks tend to leave old paper. Wolf had reached that condition of stillness, which means he is either disgusted or close to pleased. And with him the distinction is often academic. Archie, he said, you have a reflected woman, a hidden passage, a missing girl, a mother's letters, an obsolete companion, and an engagement arranged like a treaty. Now find the erased person. That sounds cheerful. It sounds necessary. Who erased her? The family, of course. Families never destroy the truth cleanly. They abridge. So I went to abridgment's natural habitat, which in New York is a combination of attics, solicitors, old servants, and municipal records that have survived by being too dull to steal. I began in the Harrow house itself, because there is no point looking downtown for scandal if the linen closets upstairs still know more than the county clerk. Mrs. Cormack met me in the upper hall with the resigned patience of a woman who had long ago accepted that any sensible day can be ruined by one man with a notebook. "You want the old rooms," she said. "Yes. Then you've reached the right hour for ghosts and dust. That's the city's best combination." She took me not to Lila's room, but farther down the second floor corridor, past the portrait gallery to a door at the rear end. One I had noticed before, only because old houses always keep one door too closed for innocence. The room beyond had been shut long enough to develop that faint, stale stillness rooms get when they have been denied both living and proper burial. It was small, square, and once had probably been meant for a companion or governess of superior standing. The wallpaper, a faded green, had lost its conviction. A narrow bed stood made under a linen sheet. There was a dressing table, a writing desk, and one little fireplace with the grate clean enough to suggest that somebody, sometime, had kept the room from becoming entirely historical. Dust lay on the surfaces, yes, but not in the complete democratic thickness you get when no one enters for years. The room had been closed. It had not been abandoned. "Whose was it?" I asked. Mrs. Cormack stood at the threshold, not entering. That too meant something. Miss Eleanor Shaw's, there it was. A name no one had used anymore, because no one had offered it to me once. Who was she? She gave me the look housekeepers reserve for men who have finally asked the one useful question an hour too late. A young woman connected to Mr. Adrian's brother, Lila's father. Yes. Connected how? The pause this time was not reluctance. It was sorting. Old houses train their keepers to speak exactly when ruin has already begun, and not before. She was brought to the house first as companion to Mrs. Harrow during an illness, Mrs. Cormack said. Later she remained because Mr. Stephen Harrow wished it. Stephen, Lila's father. And Adrian disliked it. Yes, that was not enough, but it was the right first cut. Was Eleanor Shaw his mistress? Mrs. Cormack's face did not change, which in her case usually meant the truth had just entered the room and was expected to wipe its shoes. In the house's opinion, yes. In Mrs. Harrow's opinion, not exactly in Adrian's opinion, certainly. In Mr. Stephen's own opinion. Well, gentlemen often keep those opinions from housekeepers. That's a shame. It would save everybody years. She ignored that properly. What happened to her? She left. Voluntarily. I was not consulted. Again, very neat. I stepped farther into the room and looked around. On the wall above the dressing table there was a pale rectangle in the paper, slightly cleaner than the rest. Something had hung there once and had been removed. Photograph? Yes. Of her? I believe so. Where is it now? Mrs. Cormack shook her head. Gone before my time in this room ended. That widened the room. A missing photograph is a silly thing until it isn't. Families will tolerate a room better than a face because rooms can be closed. I opened the desk, empty drawers except in the lowest one where an old envelope lay flat at the back, so yellow with age and dust that any lesser detective would have missed it by respecting the dust too much. Inside was a calling card, unmailed and unaddressed, with one name written in a neat hand, Miss Eleanor Shaw. On the back, in pencil and another hand, one line, "Not here. Not again." That was the sort of sentence houses produce after midnight and deny by breakfast. I pocketed it and asked Mrs. Cormack, "Did Lila know this room?" She was told not to come here as a child. Which means she did. Yes. Did she ask about Eleanor Shaw? Yes. Once as a girl, once after her mother died, and again a month ago. The air in the room changed then because that matched too much of what Nora Kent had said to be comfortable. What answer was she given? Different ones, depending who was cornered. Adrian. Sentimental nonsense about a poor relation. Celia. A mistake men made and women buried. That sounds like Celia. Yes, and you. Mrs. Cormack looked at the bed beneath the linen sheet. I told Miss Lila that some people leave houses and keep living in them afterward because no one will use their name honestly. That one I wrote down. From there I went after paper. Martin Dace, who by then had begun to look at me as if I were an illness the family had failed to vaccinate against, produced old correspondence under protest, and only after I told him that Wolf's patience was inferior to mine only in quantity. In the household accounts from the year before Stephen Harrow died, I found repeated small allowances to as is entered, first in a private household column, later struck out and transferred to miscellaneous domestic adjustment. That is accounting language for guilt-wearing cuffs. In a solicitor's folder, tied with faded tape, I found the legal cousin of it. No direct mention of Eleanor Shaw. But there was a memorandum regarding sensitive occupancy questions and future guardianship exposure in the event of informal dependency claims. Men with legal training can make adultery sound like drainage if you give them 3 pages and a frightened client. Then, in a packet of old family photographs, Mrs. Brent finally admitted existed, I found the match for the pale rectangle from the room wall. Or rather, I found the place where the match ought to have been. The album had one card, mount cut cleanly out with a razor. On the page beneath, in a childish hand that could only have been Lila's from years earlier, one faded, penciled word remained where the photograph had once been captioned. Nelwell. That was enough to go back downstairs and confront Celia Brent in the morning room, where she sat among flowers, coffee, and old indignation like a woman born to all 3. Eleanor Shaw, I said. She did not ask how much I knew. Good. The best witnesses know better than to make you rehearse. So Adrian finally got tired, she said. Number I got useful. Her mouth twitched without quite becoming amusement. Eleanor Shaw lived here 2 years. Stephen brought her first for Helena, Lila's mother, who was ill after the child. Eleanor was educated, poor, proud, and too pretty to remain harmless in a house where men took boredom seriously. Stephen fell in love, or believed he had discovered a more flattering inconvenience. With men like Stephen Harrow, the distinction is unpaid. Did Helena know? Yes, that came dry and flat. Helena knew everything and endured most of it badly. Adrian decided the house required hygiene. He had Eleanor removed after Stephen's death. You moved where? Celia Brent lifted a shoulder. A separate establishment for a time. Then nowhere anyone mentioned. A small allowance, I think, and silence. Was there a child? Her eyes came to mine then, not startled, not angry, simply tired in a much older way. No, she said, not that survived. There are moments when the room goes quiet, not because no one speaks, but because every object in it understands that a sentence has entered which cannot be improved. So Lila's father, I said carefully, had another young woman in the house, tied to her mother's illness, then tied to himself, then erased. Yes, and Lila found the traces. Yes, and if Miriam Voss returned, she might have returned not merely as the old companion, but as the one living witness who had known that story whole. Celia Brent nodded once. That is what frightened Lila. There it was at last. Not a stranger in a passage, not a romantic ghost, an erased woman, or the surviving witness to one, stepping back into the house through the very channels by which such things had once been managed. I took it all back to Wolf. He heard me out in the office while the late afternoon stood at the windows, pretending Manhattan could ever be softened by weather. Eleanor Shaw, the closed room, the missing photograph. The old household allowances disguised in accounts. The legal memoranda about dependency and guardianship exposure. The child's penciled Nell beneath the removed picture. Celia's confirmation, Adrian's old hygiene. A woman erased not by death but by management. When I finished, Wolf had his eyes shut. At last, he said. That sounds encouraging. It is only accurate. He opened one eye. The reflected woman was not a stranger. She was a remnant, whether in person or in consequence. Miss Harrow had discovered the erased history of her father, her mother, and Eleanor Shaw. Miriam Voss, who knew the house and the truth, re-entered. Therefore, Miss Harrow's recognition in the silver frame was not social. It was genealogical. That's an expensive word. Be quiet, Archie. He adjusted a sheet on his desk by 1/2 inch, which in Wolf is equivalent to a trumpet. That one I kept. Later, standing at my window while the city below arranged itself into light and movement and commercial deceit. I thought about the Harrow house. It had not merely hidden passages. It had hidden people, or tried to. Eleanor Shaw, young once, connected to Stephen Harrow, erased from speech, cut from albums, moved out of the room and out of the record until only fragments remained, a pale square on wallpaper, a card in a drawer, an allowance translated into bookkeeping cowardice, and a child's old penciled knell under an empty space. The reflection in the silver frame had not shown an intruder. It had shown the return of something once managed out of sight and never settled. On Riddle Street, or East 64th, if you prefer your scandal with older stone, erased women do not remain erased forever. They merely wait for the house to grow careless enough to remember them. Chapter 9. The woman in the reflection. By the time a case begins making moral sense, it usually stops being socially tolerable. That is one of the reasons rich families dislike detectives. We are bad for upholstery. We take old stuffing out and call it evidence. At the Harrow affair, we had reached the point where the furniture was no longer the problem. The problem was that the past had finally stopped hinting and begun using doors. Wolf had listened to my report on Eleanor Shaw, the closed room, the missing photograph, the household allowances disguised as bookkeeping, and the erased name that had nevertheless kept breathing in the house like a draft from under a door. Then he had shut his eyes and said, "Good. You continue to abuse that word." Number, I continue to use it correctly. The reflected woman is no longer apparition, intrusion, or decorative mystery. She is consequence. That is Wolf. Give him a ghost and he insists on an invoice. He sent me back to East 64th, with one instruction refined enough to deserve the trip. Archie, Miss Harrow, saw the woman, and did not cry out. Therefore she recognized not danger but claim. Find what was owed. That was how I came once more to Harrow House, where the family had begun to look not merely frightened, but tired in inherited ways. Adrian Harrow was avoiding direct corridors, which in itself was a confession of temperament, if not of guilt. Celia Brent had reached the stage of scandal, where her honesty was improving out of spite. Edwin Vale remained calm, controlled, and increasingly aware that calm was no longer fashionable. Nora Kent had the look of a woman holding silence for somebody else, and beginning to suspect it would break in her hands. I started with Nora because friends, when properly exhausted, become clearer than legal files. She was in the small morning room with a tray beside her that had once held tea, and now held only the evidence of nerves. She looked up as I came in and did not bother pretending surprise. "Good surprise is overrated?" "Well," she said. "Well," I told her. The woman in the reflection was tied to the past Lila had uncovered. That much is now furniture. What I need is the bill. Nora gave a short breath that might have been the beginning of laughter if the house had deserved any. "You talk like Wolf." Number, he talks like law after it has been educated. I talk like appetite. Start. She sat back and looked at the cold tea. Lila knew more than I said. Yes. She had found not only letters, she had found a notation in one of her father's old books, a payment schedule perhaps, something tied to a woman named Eleanor Shaw. At first she thought Eleanor was merely one of those women families misplaced for the sake of digestion. Then she found Miriam's old notes. That sharpened the room. What notes? Notebooks perhaps is too grand a word. Memoranda, lists, household timings, little practical things. But between them were lines, remarks. Mrs. H. wept after luncheon again. Miss not permitted downstairs before guests arrive. Mr. A insists the child be told nothing. That was good enough to bruise. Lila showed you these. Only 2 pages. She was shaking when she did it. Not from fear, exactly. From the effort of making the house line up with the truth. Go on. She said if Miriam Voss returned, then Miriam would not be coming only to frighten Adrian or expose a scandal. She would be coming because something had been owed all along and never paid. That matched Wolf's word exactly and improved my opinion of both of them. Owed what? Nora's eyes met mine. Recognition first, and perhaps justice if there is any market for it. I let that sit because once a witness gives you the right noun, You should not crowd it with adjectives. So last night, I said, Lila sees the woman in the silver reflection and knows immediately not merely that someone has come back. But why? Yes, why? Because she had read enough to understand that her mother had not merely lost a companion, and her father had not merely behaved badly. A whole woman had been removed from the story. Lila said once that it is one thing to discover your father sinned, another to discover the family decorated the sin afterward and made everyone speak of it as correction. That was a very Lila sentence from what I had by then learned of her. I asked, did she think the woman in the reflection was Eleanor Shaw herself? Nora shook her head slowly. Number Eleanor would be too old now, if alive. Lila believed it must be Miriam Voss. Why Miriam? Because Miriam knew, because Miriam had stayed long enough to see the whole thing, because Miriam loved Lila's mother in the loyal way families call dangerous, when it refuses to flatter them. And because if anyone were to return, it would be the one person who had survived the house without agreeing to its version. That was not proof, but it was shape, and shape matters before dinner. I said, then Lila sees Miriam in the reflection, recognizes the hat, the stance, the route by the hidden panel, and goes to meet her. Yes, willingly. Nora's fingers tightened on the edge of the tray. Yes, or as willingly as anyone goes to hear the truth after spending weeks finding out it has been waiting in the walls. That was better than fear. It was motive for motion. I left Nora with the last of her tea and took the result to Edwin Vale. He was in the library this time, standing by the mantel with the expression of a man who had begun the week expecting matrimony, and found instead that he had become a supporting figure in old family surgery. You've come back to inform me. I was even less central than I feared, he said. That would save time. Yes. He took it with decent stamina. I gave him the broad line. Lila had seen the reflected woman and understood who she was. The recognition led not to alarm, but to pursuit or meeting. If Miriam Voss had returned, she had returned not merely to upset a family arrangement, but to settle something much older. Edwin listened, and then did one of the few truly useful things I had ever seen him do. He stopped, arranging his face. She told me on Thursday, he said, that some debts are not financial but still collect interest. I stared. And you neglected to share that because I thought she was speaking about the engagement. Well, that was vain of you. Yes, he said flatly. I am beginning to understand that. That helped. Vanity admitted is nearly as useful as guilt denied. What else? I asked. He frowned, thinking not socially but accurately, which improved him. She said if the woman came back, then the house would have to look at itself without silver. I thought she meant Adrian, or her aunt, or some theatrical family reckoning. He paused. I did not think she meant she would go with her. That was the first time anyone had said it aloud, and the room accepted it at once because it had already been waiting on the phrase. Go with her. Not be taken. Not dragged, not seized. Go. I said, did Lila love you? He looked at the fireplace, then back at me. Not enough to stay for stability once truth offered another direction. That was the best thing Edwin Vale ever said to me, and it almost made a man of him. From there I went to Celia Brent because she had reached the point where truth offended her less than cowardice. She went willingly, Celia said before I had properly begun. That saved us both a minute. You know that. Yes, how? How? Because Lila inherited the one inconvenient thing from her mother that the house never managed to discipline. Once she had decided to know, she would go through any door not nailed shut by law. That was first rate. She saw Miriam, I said. Yes, and understood. Yes, and went after her. Celia Brent gave me a level look. Not after, with. There it was again. Why? Because Miriam would not have returned for melodrama. She would have returned with proof, or with a person, perhaps both. Person, Celia's mouth thinned. You are late, Mr. Goodwin. I am tired, so I will say what Adrian should have said years ago, and never would. Eleanor Shaw did not merely vanish. She bore Stephen Harrow a child. The child was removed, placed, and accounted for in ways that allowed the family to go on dining respectably. Well, some facts do not so much enter a room as replace it. I sat down because although I am not Wolf and do not weigh enough to make chairs fear me, I do prefer sitting when old family crimes begin reproducing. The child lived. Yes, known to Miriam? Yes, known to Helena Harrow? Celia Brent shut her eyes briefly. Known too late, and in fragments. Known to Lila. Not until recently, not with certainty. She had guessed some offense. She had not guessed blood. I let out breath, and Miriam came back for recognition.
Yes.
And for what was owed. Yes, meaning. Celia looked toward the door, though there was nobody there. Old habit families look toward thresholds before saying anything that should have been said years ago. Meaning money, perhaps. Legal acknowledgement, perhaps. But more than that, truth in the right order. A life cannot be made proper after the fact by omission. Miriam knew that. So did Helena. At the end, Adrian never did. That was enough to take to Wolf, but I wanted one more, Adrian himself. He tried denial, then disgust, then fatigue, and finally what passes in old houses for honesty when there is nothing left but shape. Yes, he said, there was a child. No, I did not place it myself. Yes, arrangements were made, the woman was provided for, the matter ended. No, I told him, that's the sentence you paid for. It didn't end, it went away. He closed his eyes. What do you want from me now? The truth in smaller pieces than you are used to spending. He looked at me and, perhaps for the first time in the case, seemed older than his control. Miriam Voss returned, because she had found the girl, the woman now. She intended Lila to know before the engagement made another arrangement out of her life. If Lila saw Miriam in the reflection, she would have understood at once. Not everything, enough. And she went, yes. Willingly, yes. That finished it. Back on West 35th, Wolf heard me in full, from Nora's phrase about debts collecting interest to Edwin's admission, to Celia's disclosure, to Adrian's exhausted correction, the reflected woman tied to the past. Miriam Voss returning not for revenge merely, though I was sure revenge did not entirely miss the train, but for recognition, and for something owed, truth, name, inheritance, perhaps all three braided together as family sins usually are. Lila seeing her in the silver, and understanding instantly that the past had at last arrived in person. No struggle because no abduction, no cry because no immediate fear. A meeting, not a seizure. When I finished, Wolf had his eyes shut. Yes, you would use that word at a hanging. Number hangings are less exact. He opened one eye. Miss Harrow walked away from her engagement and from the life arranged for her, because she recognized, in the reflection, the witness to her family's central omission, and perhaps the consequence of it. Good. That sounds very nearly cheerful. It is not cheerful, it is orderly. He lifted one finger. Now the case changes. We are no longer asking who took Miss Harrow. We are asking where she went, with whom, and whether the person who summoned her intends justice, leverage, or both. I stood up. At the door, Wolf stopped me with one more. Archie. Yes, people imagine that willing departure is innocence. It is not. It is merely different danger. Find Miss Voss before the family does anything stupid, which given their history should not take long. That stayed with me later, at my window again, with the city below making light into temporary evidence. The woman in the reflection was no longer a spectre, a blackmailer, or some melodramatic visitation from the wrong side of respectability. She was part of the past Lila had only recently learned to name. Miriam Voss had come back not simply to accuse, but to be seen, and to place before Lila whatever had been owed all these years, and kept in separate ledgers by cowards. Lila had seen her in the silver and known at once. That was why there had been no struggle. No sound, no farewell. She had walked away from the life waiting for her because something older, buried, and finally named, had stepped into the room and looked at her directly. Chapter 10, The Bride Who Stepped Out of the Frame in the End. The photograph told the story because none of the witnesses had the courage to tell it straight. That is often the way with old houses and old families. The silver sees first, the servants second, and the blood relations only after the thing has cost enough to be called tragic. At Harrow House, the cost had been accruing for years, in little domestic installments. One woman removed from speech, one child moved into secrecy, one companion dismissed as if loyalty were a stain, one daughter raised among polished omissions, and finally, one engagement arranged over the whole architecture, like a lace cloth, spread across a cracked table. Wolf had reached his conclusion by 6 o'clock, and as usual, disliked being hurried into explaining it to anybody who did not live in his house or improve his meals. Unfortunately, Adrian Harrow, Edwin Vale, Celia Brent, Nora Kent, Martin Dace, and Inspector Kramer had all by then become too entangled in the matter to be denied the red leather chair and its surrounding punishments. So by 8:30 our office on West 35th contained enough money, grievance, and official impatience to make the wallpaper listen. Fritz, who had served dinner with an expression suggesting that homicide was tolerable only if it kept proper hours, had withdrawn in dignified disgust. Wolf sat behind his desk, broad, settled, and in full possession of the room's intelligence. I stood by the globe, which is my usual position when truth is about to become expensive. Kramer had taken the chair nearest the door because policemen like exits. Adrian Harrow sat upright, as if posture could redeem blood. Celia Brent had the look of a woman who had long ago decided the family was vulgar, and had now been proved right in a way that denied all satisfaction. Edwin Vale remained calm, which by then had ceased to reassure anyone. Nora Kent sat very still, hands folded, watching Wolf, the way a woman watches a doctor before he names the disease aloud. Lila Harrow was not there. That was the point. Wolf began without flourish. Miss Harrow was not abducted. No one interrupted, though Adrian Harrow's fingers tightened once on the arm of the chair. She saw in the reflection of the silver frame a woman she recognized not necessarily by face but by implication. The figure stood at the hidden panel entrance in the side passage, a position requiring knowledge of the house. Her posture was directed specifically at Miss Harrow, not at the room generally. Therefore, the reflected woman intended Miss Harrow to see her. The photograph preserved that intention. He paused, not for effect, but because in Wolf punctuation is often moral. The woman was Miriam Voss. Celia Brent shut her eyes once and opened them again. Adrian Harrow did not move. Miriam Voss, Wolf went on, had once served in the Harrow household as companion to Mrs. Helena Harrow. She knew the house, its passages, and its hypocrisies. She also knew the truth about Eleanor Shaw. At the name, Edwin Vale looked at Nora Kent, not at Adrian. That was useful and mildly contemptible. Wolf continued. Eleanor Shaw lived in the house after being brought there in connection with Mrs. Harrow's illness. She later became attached to Stephen Harrow, Miss Harrow's father. She bore him a child. The child was removed from the house and from conversation alike. Eleanor Shaw was subsequently erased by means familiar to rich families. An allowance disguised in accounts, a room closed, a photograph cut from an album, and a name omitted long enough for omission to begin passing as innocence. Adrian Harrow said, "This is monstrous." Wolf turned his head slightly. "Number, it is ordinary. That is the scandal." Kramer grunted. He appreciates clear abuse when it is not directed at the police. Wolf ignored him. Miss Harrow, in recent weeks, discovered letters, memoranda, and household traces sufficient to establish that her family history had been falsified. She learned of Eleanor Shaw. She suspected more. Then Miriam Voss returned, having found the child, now an adult woman, and intending that Miss Harrow should know the truth before her engagement made another arrangement out of her life. Nora Kent let out a breath. Adrian Harrow went still in the dangerous way men do when all their private tidiness begins catching fire at once. Wolf lifted a finger. This is the crucial point. Miss Harrow did not cry out because she was not being attacked. She was being summoned by truth. The reflected woman did not come to seize her. She came to be recognized. Miss Harrow saw her, understood enough at once, and left the room voluntarily to meet her. Edwin Vale said quietly, "Then where is she?" Wolf looked at him. "Not here," which you already knew was possible. That hit harder than a shout would have, he went on. Miriam Voss entered by familiarity and left with Miss Harrow by willingness. The hidden passages of Harrow House assisted, because the house had always assisted concealment. The same architecture used for servants, propriety, and selective sight became the means by which the buried past presented itself to the daughter of the house. The engagement party did not create the crisis. It merely assembled enough silver, witnesses, and false harmony for the revelation to find a polished surface. I said, because it was time and because Wolf likes translation when it improves discomfort. The engagement, the house, and the life prepared for Lila were all built on silence. Yes, Wolf said, precisely. Adrian Harrow found his voice then, though not to advantage. If Miss Voss has taken her— No, Wolf snapped. Stop using the vocabulary of management. Miss Harrow stepped out of your arrangement. She was not carried from it. That quieted the room better than any law. Wolf settled back. Miss Voss came not to hide within silence, but to break it. She brought Miss Harrow to a place where the omitted history could be explained without family censorship. Archie found the address this afternoon from an old forwarding note in a settlement file. Your secretary believed had been destroyed. Miss Harrow is safe. There was an actual second, perhaps two, in which no one breathed correctly. Then Nora Kent said, "Safe." Yes. Celia Brent closed her eyes again and this time left them closed long enough to count. Adrian Harrow said, in a voice too controlled to be useful, "Where?" Wolf's eyes narrowed. That depends on your intention. Miss Harrow is an adult woman. She has left a house built on suppression and an engagement founded partly on her fatigue. Unless she chooses to return, she will not be fetched like a parcel merely because her uncle finds publicity exhausting. Kramer, who had until then shown uncommon patience, stirred. Wolf, if there's no crime, there is no kidnapping, Wolf said. There may be civil ugliness later, if the family insists on dignifying itself by process. But Miss Harrow went willingly. Archie spoke to her an hour ago by telephone, in the presence of Miss Voss and the other woman. That caused the last real disturbance in the room. Edwin Vale leaned forward. Other woman. Wolf nodded once. The daughter of Stephen Harrow and Eleanor Shaw, your prospective wife's half-sister, though the term will undoubtedly offend the housekeeping. That was a hard blow, and because it was entirely deserved, I enjoyed it with moderation, Celia Brent said, almost to herself. So Helena knew. Wolf answered, late, imperfectly, and with no power left to reorder the men around her. The evidence suggests she tried, in small ways, to preserve what she could. Miriam's notes, the mirror, the letters not destroyed. She failed to alter the house while she lived. Her daughter has done so by leaving it. That was nearly generous, which from Wolf counts as sentiment under armed guard. Edwin Vale stood up then because some men can only receive truth vertically. You spoke to Lila. Yes, Wolf said. And Wolf regarded him without affection. She asked that you not pursue her until she has decided whether the life proposed to her can survive knowledge of the one concealed beneath it. That is an intelligent request. You would be wise to obey it. Edwin absorbed that, like a man swallowing medicine, whose label he had once approved for somebody else. Adrian Harrow said, "This is intolerable." Celia Brent opened her eyes and turned her head. "No, Adrian, it is merely spoken." That was the best line of the evening, not issued by Wolf, and I was sorry it could not be engraved somewhere expensive. Kramer got up. "Then I'm going." "Yes," Wolf said. "Take Mr. Harrow's temper with you if possible. That would take a truck." He went, the others did not immediately. Houses may conceal truth for years, but once it is finally spoken, the survivors have a tendency to sit in it like bad weather, because moving would mean admitting it was real. Nora Kent was the first to manage something useful. Did she sound frightened? I answered that one because Wolf had already spent enough mercy for the hour. Number tired, clear, and angry in a healthy direction. Nora nodded and lowered her head, which was as close to prayer as the room deserved. Adrian Harrow rose stiffly. "You are telling me my niece has chosen disgrace?" Wolf's eyes came open fully. "It is not a sight one seeks without appetite for risk." "No," he said. "I am telling you she has refused arrangement. Confuse the two if you like, it has been the Harrow method for years." That finished Adrian, if not morally, then at least conversationally. They left gradually. Celia Brent, last of the family. Nora Kent after her. Edwin Vale with his composure bent but not broken. Adrian Harrow carrying indignation like an antique. He no longer had room to display. When the door had closed behind them all, the office grew larger and better. I turned to Wolf. "You could have softened one or two edges. Number, not even for variety. Number, that is Wolf, and why I prefer him to nearly everyone else, including some otherwise good women." The next day, the newspapers did not get the story they had hoped for. There was no kidnapped heiress, no hysterical collapse, no society bride found drugged in a taxicab or floating tastefully in the East River. There was only a discreet postponement of an engagement, a statement from the Harrow family requesting privacy, and a social editor's sly note that Miss Harrow had withdrawn temporarily from public engagements. Withdrawn? That was very like the city. If a woman refuses the life prepared for her, they always choose a verb that sounds like upholstery being covered for summer. What had actually happened was simpler and much better. Lila Harrow had stepped out of the frame, not, literally the photographer would have objected. But in the moral sense, yes, she had been standing in one of those rooms where everything had been positioned around her. The fiancé fée, the flowers, the silver, the dead mother's portrait, the guests, the future, and then she had looked into the polished reflection and seen not merely a woman but a truth long delayed. Miriam Voss had come not to drag her into scandal, but to stop the house from completing another arrangement in ignorance. The missing woman in the silver had broken silence rather than hidden in it. Wolf uncovered what had been buried. He always does. But not everything returned to where it began, because very little ever should. Lila did not come back to the house. Not then, perhaps not ever. The half-sister remained where Miriam had brought her into safe daylight, with counsel now retained that did not depend on Adrian Harrow's definition of decency. The engagement to Edwin Vale was not renewed, though I suspect he would have accepted any future Lila chose if it came in correct order and did not publicly sneer at his tailoring. Celia Brent, I am glad to say, survived the truth because she had been living near it all along. Adrian Harrow remained what he was, a man who believed control was civilization and discovered too late that omission is not the same as burial. And on East 64th Street, where silver had once reflected the wrong woman into the right moment, the house went on being large, old, handsome, and not nearly so safe from its own memory as before. Later that week, standing by the window in my room on West 35th, and looking down at the city doing its usual tricks with rain and headlights, I thought about missing persons. Most of them are lost in the ordinary ways: money, men, bad judgment, worse luck, subway stairs, ambition, or gin. But once in a while a missing person isn't lost at all. Once in a while she has merely walked out of the place where she was being kept correctly and declined to return to it. On Riddle Street, or anywhere else in New York, where families bury women under etiquette and paper that counts as disappearance only to the people left behind. To the woman herself, it is often the first accurate movement she has made in years.